Manus Island, which we know, of course, mainly in connection with the offshore processing and holding there of refugees who wanted to come to Australia, before that had another significance for Australia and for the world, in fact. During World War II, the US, together with Australia and other allies, operated out of a deep natural harbour on Manus Island, where today there is a bit of a relic, a leftover from that time, the Lombran Naval Base. It's just a sad rundown shadow of its former self. But the Allies used that in World War II to very good effect. And the effect was this, that the Japanese had established a major force, nearly 40,000 troops, nearby on another island in Papua New Guinea, in Rabaul. And instead of directly attacking frontally that Japanese force to drive them out of the Pacific, out of the South Pacific, the Allies instead cut it off using that port on Manus Island. And that was very effective. It cut, operating from Manus Island, the US Navy and the Australians and the Kiwis and the Brits and others cut off the sea and air connections of the main Japanese force at Rabaul from resupply from Tokyo. And what I pointed out today was a point made to me by a historian, military historian at the University of Western Australia, Peter Dean, that you could today use Manus Island and the naval base that the PNG forces maintain there to do the same thing, to cut off, in the event that China were to eventually go ahead and build any kind of military base in the Solomon Islands, that a base in Manus Island could do the same today to a Chinese base in the Solomons as the Allies did to a Japanese base 70 years ago.
That is fascinating. To do that, though, you wouldn't expect Australia to operate on its own. You would imagine it would require a broader vision beyond just Australia.
Yes, first you'd have to get approval from PNG to use the base for Australian operations. At the moment, there's a very modest redevelopment underway that Australia proposed with the Papua New Guinea government. Interestingly enough, the Americans, under Donald Trump, this was in 2018 actually, the Americans asked to join that effort and did. So already you've got the basis there for the US, Australia, Papua New Guinea to cooperate in the redevelopment of that port as a naval base. Problem is that, as we know with Australian defence acquisitions and movements generally, it's too little too late. The agreement with PNG and the US was reached in 2018. It took 2 years to let a contract to get anything started. Work only actually began construction another year later, so it took 3 years. Nearly 4 years into it, there's hardly anything happened. And that redevelopment itself is only big enough to take small boats, patrol boats, nothing near the scale required for a serious naval base.
Would it not seem to be preemptive of what China might do, though, even as much as we've learned about their potential plans for Solomon Islands? Would it be preemptive of the US, say, Japan and Australia to band together in a sort of Pacific, broader vision to manage that threat by developing a proper base on Manus?
Yes, well, two points there, Bev. One is that in the strictly military strategy view, the Australian PNG American agreement to redevelop that, and it's less than $200 million for this redevelopment, it's quite modest, was in fact an urgent response to the news that a Chinese state-owned company was redeveloping an airbase, an airport nearby. And the Australians realised that they were in the process of being outmanoeuvred. There were credible reports that Chinese interests were about to make a similar bid to redevelop the Lombran Naval Base on Manus Island. And so they went ahead and proposed this redevelopment to PNG, brought in the US as a counter to China. So rather than preempting China in this case, it was actually trying to catch up with where China already seemed to be heading. But in the larger sense of your question, Bev, there is plenty of opportunity. I mean, that's just a military strategy. If Australia is looking for solidarity with the Pacific Islands, rather than just blathering about, nostrums about a Pacific family, working with the Pacific Islands, with the Pacific Islands Forum, which includes all the Pacific Islands countries, plus Australia and New Zealand, but not China, and bringing in, as you say, Japan, US, France, or another major regional power, to develop a larger vision for the future of the whole region, to give the Pacific Islands countries what they want, using advantages that we could present that the Chinese can't, all sorts of things, labour and citizenship opportunities, opportunities with social connections with churches and rugby, very important, connector points, as well as development aid and all sorts of other assistance and meaningful conversations about climate change. Again, that's an area where our Chinese friends can't compete, because China's even further behind than Australia is when it comes to reducing emissions.
Does the election that we're going through at the moment give us that possible reset? But it would require some sort of very strong leadership and vision, would it not?
Yes, I think the answer to both parts of that is yes. Now that this shock has been administered to Australia, that we have discovered that Australia has been comprehensively outmanoeuvred by China in this political agreement with the government of Solomon Islands to potentially establish a Chinese military base, that is a shock to the system. After the election in 3 weeks' time, whoever is Prime Minister does have a fresh opportunity to use that galvanising shock to shake up Australia's entire approach. We've been asleep diplomatically, asleep militarily. There's just no cohesive national effort and ambition, and certainly no urgency. And that concept that you could have an agreement with Papua New Guinea to redevelop a port nearly 4 years ago and barely anything to have happened, that entire way of thinking, the processes, the urgency, needs to be jettisoned and a whole new urgency and purpose injected. So the opportunity is there for the next Prime Minister. Let's hope that he, it's inevitably going to be a he, takes it.
Good to talk, Pete. Thanks so much.
Pleasure, Beth.